Shadow Freddy and Shadow Bonnie, or more formally, Shadow Freddy and RWQFSFASXC. What the hell are these guys? This has been a thorn in my side for a long time. Like, it started as just a cool Easter egg, and then suddenly they were incredibly important to the plot, and then they disappeared forever, and now Shadow Bonnie's back again in special delivery. They're important, but what are they? Well, that's what we're going to try and figure out today. So slices, put on your aprons, and let's bake ourselves a theory. Speaking of putting on aprons, we still have some more in stock. Thank you so much for the people who ordered them. Link down below, thank you. First, let's gather our ingredients. We're going to need every single bit of information on these guys if we're going to figure out anything. Starting with their first appearances in FNAF II, they were both sort of just cool Easter eggs. Shadow Bonnie would appear in your office with 1,000,000 to 1 odds. Flash it away with a flashlight, or it would crash your game. No jump scare though. Similarly, Shadow Freddy would rarely appear in the parts and service screen. You would just have to tab away from him to make him go away, but if you didn't, he would also crash your game. Again, no jump scare. It is important to note though that while Shadow Bonnie is pure black, Vanta black actually, if you brighten the image on Shadow Freddy, he's actually a dark purple. Not sure if it's important, but it is noteworthy. Now let's move on to a meteor game entry, FNAF 3. These guys are actually super important for the plot here, so let's dig deep. The only during gameplay Easter egg of either of them really comes in the form of Shadow Freddy, who can very rarely appear in the very left side of your office. Granted, he doesn't do anything, he's just kind of there, but it's important to note. However, in the in-between night minigames, he's a leading role. The minigames are called Follow Me, in which we follow Shadow Freddy throughout the FNAF 1 location as one of the FNAF 1 animatronics. Each time we follow him for a while, typically ending in this room where we get disassembled by William Afton. But the Freddy files do specify that they're positive. Quote, "They help the children. In the night end minigames, Shadow Freddy tries to lead you to the killer who's hiding out in the safe room." So that's worth mentioning. Shadow Bonnie doesn't actually appear in-game at all. Now there are Easter eggs that reference Shadow Bonnie, specifically the paper plate pal and the figure on the desk, but Shadow Bonnie itself doesn't appear. However, in the Happiest Day minigames, you play as Shadow Bonnie, specifically in the second to last one where you glitch through every previous minigame to eventually give cake to a crying child. This feels super important, but I have no idea why it does this. The Freddy files also point this out as positive. Quote, "Shadow Bonnie gives cake to one of the children," which seems benevolent. Wait a minute. One of the children? These aren't all just the same child? There's multiple crying children in these games? I'm gonna put a pin in that because that's for another day. Now, do these guys appear anywhere else? Well, their next appearance chronologically in release would be FNAF World, where they're both playable characters. Shadow Freddy's loading screen quote is "I will eat your soul," which is a little intense, but Shadow Bonnie's quote is "Say my name," which is kind of like a silly reference to the fact that his name is RXQFSF. Shadow Freddy has 3 attacks: Unscrew, Escape Key, and Water Hose. On the other hand, Shadow Bonnie's 3 attacks are Haunting, Mimic Ball, and Gift Boxes. It's worth noting that Shadow Freddy's attacks are all one-hit KO moves, being incredibly aggressive, whereas Shadow Bonnie's attacks are summoning something, and healing the team. So they definitely seem like offensive and defensive counterparts of one another. The next appearance chronologically could be argued to be Freddy Fazbear Pizzeria Simulator. Now, granted, I don't myself believe in this one, but it's mentioned a lot in the community, so it's worth mentioning here. Some people argue that these glitches at the very beginning of the game are Shadow Freddy. I don't think it holds water because 1, it's gray, not purple or black, and 2, it kind of just looks like a glitchy version of your character. It could even be Lefty, but it doesn't look like Shadow Freddy to me. Regardless, I'll mention it here. Shadow Bonnie doesn't show up in this game at all. However, in Ultimate Custom Night, Shadow Bonnie is one of the animatronics that can be summoned by Dee Dee. Granted, he doesn't really do anything to you. He just turns off all the lights in your office for 10 seconds. You can't stop him, and he'll just go away on his own. The next entry of these 2 is in Special Delivery, specifically Shadow Bonnie. One of the main side modes in Special Delivery is Gathering Remnant. Anytime you gather Remnant, eventually Dark Remnant will show up. Collect enough of this, and Shadow Bonnie will appear, being aggressive towards the player. This all might be the game's version of Agony, but I don't want to get ahead of ourselves here. Essentially, in one of the most common side modes of this game, Shadow Bonnie is like the main antagonist, so a really big role actually, and it exists to stop the player from collecting Remnant. After Special Delivery, well, the only other references we have of them are in this cardboard cutout of Shadow Bonnie in Help Wanted and in Security Breach. Other than that, they're kind of gone. wish you could see outside this place. Feels like I've been in here for months. Oh well, keep on keeping on. Oh, a sponsor. Maybe this will give me something. Today's video is brought to you by Morgan & Morgan Injury Law Firm. Have you been hurt in an accident? No, you haven't. But shh. No, you silly little lamb. You haven't, because there are no accidents. Whether it's due to a person, product, or place, if you've been hurt, it's due to negligence, not just bad luck. And if negligence has injured you, you can check out Morgan & Morgan, because they win a lot. Companies fear going to court with Morgan & Morgan, not just because they're America's biggest injury law firm, but they're made up of bulldogs who fight for massive settlements. So insurance companies tend to settle quickly, and for more. I mean, what more could you ask for in good representation? What could it be worth? What is your health worth to you? You have to have the audacity to ask what your future is worth. And to Morgan & Morgan, that fee is free. There are no upfront costs, sign-up fees, and you don't even pay unless Morgan & Morgan wins your case. So if you want to reach out to Morgan & Morgan, go ahead and click the link there, in the description, or in the comments, and start a conversation. Thanks again to Morgan & Morgan for sponsoring today's video. Morgan & Morgan, for the people. What is this? Oh, is this like a Beauty and the Beast kind of like world mirror thing? Show me home. Oh, cool. Oh yeah, there's Amy. There's the cats. There's the baby. Everyone's doing okay. Wait a minute. Is that me? No. That can't be me recording at home, because I'm in here. But if I'm in here, who's out there? Am I real? Is he real? What is going on? Alright, so that's every reference to these guys that I can find. So let's mix our ingredients and see what kind of theories start to form. The most confusing part about them, in my opinion, is their purpose in the story, because that seems to change with every game and context within the same game. In FNAF 2, they both seem fairly aggressive. After all, they'll very rarely show up, but when they do, they just end your game straight out. But to be fair, neither of them have a jump scare, so it could be argued they're not actually killing the security guard, they're just ending the game. It's hard to tell. But then in FNAF 3, they're both helpful. Their guiding lost spirits are trying to take down William. In FNAF World, they're polar opposites. One of them is incredibly deadly, and the other is incredibly supportive. And then Shadow Bonnie turns around and becomes violent again in Special Delivery. On the surface, this is just nonsense. They keep flip-flopping what they're trying to do in each game. But I think that's because we're still on the surface. So let's try to figure out what they're made of and see if that illuminates any possible motivations for the actions they're taking. The biggest hint to what they're made of, in my opinion, comes from Special Delivery. After all, the more Remnant you collect, the more you summon Dark Remnant, and the more Dark Remnant you collect, Shadow Bonnie will appear. This and their similar color scheme seems to imply that either Shadow Bonnie is made up of, or has some domain over this Dark Remnant. What is Dark Remnant? Well, it's hard to tell in just the games. However, one of the books goes into the fact that this is sort of the yin to Remnant's yang. If Remnant is a manifestation of positive emotions and soul, Dark Remnant is the opposite, the negative emotions. In this way, it's actually extremely similar to Agony from the books. Let me take a step back. In the FNAF franchise, it's fairly established and accepted that when you die, your soul can attach itself to an object. We see this with every game, haunted animatronics. That's what's happening. However, in the games and the books, some people experimented on these objects, melting them down into a silvery substance that William Afton coined as Remnant. In the games, this is like a silvery metallic liquid that's kept in a dormant state due to heat, but with specific tools, it can be injected into animatronics or people to inject that soul into that animatronic or person. And apparently it seems that when Remnant forms, so does its counterpart, Dark Remnant. In Special Delivery in the books, Remnant seems to take this floating, shining form. However, in the books, it goes into more detail into what Dark Remnant could be, calling it agony. Agony in the books is described as the strongest human emotion, and if felt in great enough magnitude upon death, it can possess things just like Remnant, or at least take on the shape of certain things. It's an incredibly important aspect to certain book characters like Eleanor. Granted, I haven't gotten to that part in the book yet, but I'm trying. I'm reading as fast as I can. So we're not going to go too deep into what the books say about agony, but the basic concept of it does support the idea that Shadow Freddy and Shadow Bonnie could be made up of this agony or dark remnant, and honestly, I think that's the most likely scenario. Clearly, they're not possessed animatronics, there's no suit that looks like that. They seem to be spirits all their own that are incredibly visually similar to Dark Remnant. But if that's the case, then we'll need to figure out where did they come from, where did they go? Where did they come from, Freddy Shadow? If we are to assume that Shadow Freddy and Shadow Bonnie are made up of Dark Remnant, then we'll need to trace them back to an event that would create Remnant, and with it, its counterpart. Something painful, something tragic, and specifically, something that would have reason to form into the shapes of a Freddy animatronic and a Toy Bonnie animatronic. Granted, I say Toy Bonnie, but the model isn't exactly one-to-one. However, it's clear that in every iteration, Shadow Bonnie is much more visually similar to Toy Bonnie than any other version of Bonnie we've seen, except technically in the 8-bit Happiest Day minigame, but it is an 8-bit minigame, so it's kind of hard to get good representations within it. The first events that come to mind are the 2 instances where 5 children were killed at once at a Freddy Fazbear's, the missing child incident and the dead child incident. I mean, that is plenty of remnant and agony, and since they were killed at a Freddy's, those animatronics would be fresh on the mind. But one issue. Both of these creatures appeared during the gameplay of FNAF 2, and it's very likely that the dead child incident occurred after the gameplay of FNAF 2. So that incident couldn't have spawned either of these creatures. So they could have both formed from the missing child incident, but then why did it form into 2 creatures? This seems loose, so let's go over some other candidates before we lock this in. What other candidates do we have? Well, we have a speculative one from the tapes of FNAF 3. In them, they mentioned that the springlock suits are decommissioned due to multiple simultaneous springlock failures. Now, you could argue that this is the Bite of 83 they're talking about, but one, they mentioned multiple simultaneous, and I would argue that this is just one, but also, this might not even be a springlock failure. After all, when the springlocks fail, they snap shut into animatronic mode, and when this kid's head is put in the mouth of an animatronic, it's already in animatronic mode. So a springlock failure shouldn't technically cause a bite down. It's more likely just either a mechanical issue or the animatronic functioning as normally, not expecting there to be a kid's head in there. So we could infer that these multiple simultaneous springlock failures are employees being inside the suits, both being crushed, similar to how William Afton dies and eventually becomes Springtrap. This would be why the suits were put away for safety concerns. And if the only springlock suits we know about are Fredbear and Spring Bonnie, that's pretty good. Granted, it's Toy Bonnie, but still, it's a Bonnie. It seems like a slam dunk. One Freddy, one Bonnie, and they die in a horribly agonizing, horrific fashion. Boom, agony creatures. But I do have one big issue with this theory. It doesn't explain their aggressiveness. Granted, we don't really know how agony functions, so maybe agony is just naturally aggressive. But Shadow Freddy and Shadow Bonnie seem hell-bent on doing specific tasks that random employees that died from a workplace accident wouldn't know about or care about. Why would they be trying to stop William or help children move on? They're just employees that got caught up in a terrible situation. Sure, they could have stuck around and saw things happen and then choose to intervene, but why would they have stuck around in the first place if it was just a terrible accident? And they wouldn't have known about the missing child incident before their deaths, because as we hear from the FNAF 3 tapes, the missing child incident happens after this, because the warning to not use the Spring Bonnie suit is made in the same tape as the warning to not take people into the back room. Well, do we have any other potential characters? There is one that I hear a lot in the community that I personally don't like. Some people argue that these shadow creatures are manifestations of William's wickedness, specifically Shadow Freddy. Essentially, William's terribleness as a person and his pain and agony and death as Springtrap formed into a creature. Thematically, that's cool and all, but I think this is kind of technically impossible. First off, we see Shadow Freddy and Shadow Bonnie in the FNAF 2 gameplay, which pretty arguably happens before William gets Springtrapped. But even more solidly, we see Shadow Freddy directly before William gets springlocked, so we know it exists before he dies. But even if these creatures somehow do spawn from William's wickedness, why would Shadow Bonnie then go on to give a cake to a crying child? None of this adds up to William in any way. I don't think this is possible. We have a few possible candidates, so let's try to mix that with some actions that they take and see if we can deduce a motive. In FNAF 2, both Shadow Freddy and Shadow Bonnie are aggressive towards a night shift security guard. In FNAF 3, Shadow Freddy attempts to lead the FNAF 1 animatronics to go hunt after William Afton, eventually leading to him getting spring-locked. And Shadow Bonnie is attempting to help the crying child move on. In FNAF World, they're both there to help the plot, but Shadow Freddy is aggressive and Shadow Bonnie is supportive. In Special Delivery, Shadow Bonnie attacks the player if they try to collect Remnant. And technically, Shadow Bonnie shows up in Ultimate Custom Night, but everything in there is created by the Vengeful Spirit, so it's hard to argue if Shadow Bonnie is there at all. Then, the candidates we have for either creature are either adult employees who died in Springlock suits, or the children from the Missing Children incident. One is Agony, born of the pain of dying in a Springlock suit, and the other is the agony of being killed by William Afton. I'm not sure if a workplace accident could cause the type of dark remnant necessary to create these two beings. So the question becomes, if the only candidate we have is the Missing Child incident, why are there two creatures? I guess that means that it's not all of them, but specifically two children that were killed by William Afton. Well, what two souls are strong enough, or which two children had such strong agony to form Shadow Freddy and then Shadow Bonnie? Especially two very distinct spirits. Freddy is out to get William, and Bonnie is just trying to protect the children. In fact, it actually reflects two spirits we know about in canon. Two very strong spirits that are already players in the story. Charlie and Cassidy. Cassidy is, as far as we can tell, the Vengeful Spirit, a victim of the Missing Child incident shoved into the Golden Freddy suit, who's vowed to follow William as long as he survives. Charlie, on the other hand, arguably William's first victim, is just trying to make sure that other children aren't lost or stuck like she is. She guides them to the suits so they're not lost. She helps them move on when she can. Shadow Freddy and Shadow Bonnie almost seem like a dark reflection of Cassidy and Charlie's role within the franchise. They're more aggressive for sure, but they still have the same goals. Stop Afton, save children. I think we're onto something, but what would this mean? Well, let's pop our mixture into the oven and see what kind of horrors rise. In William's many crimes, some consequences go unforeseen. One such consequence is agony. As William killed children, either to collect their remnant or just for revenge, he formed another entity entirely. Unbeknownst to him, two children spawned other creatures upon their deaths. Their souls went on to possess animatronics, but their agony lived on. When Charlotte was killed, she possessed the marionette, and then went on to help the other children that William victimized, giving them another shot at life, helping them to move on in death. But her pain formed something different altogether. Shadow Bonnie, another entity that at its core wants to help children, but more aggressively. If it suspected someone wanted to hurt children or gather remnant, Shadow Bonnie put a stop to it. An aggressive foe to be sure, but still a guardian, nothing like its counterpart. When William killed Cassidy, he wasn't aware that he was creating his undoing. Cassidy's soul went on to possess Golden Freddy and become the Vengeful Spirit, haunting Afton's in any way she could. But her pain also formed into itself. Shadow Freddy, an aggressive entity obsessed with the end of William Afton. It's due to Shadow Freddy that William gets spring-locked in the first place, and even after, it remained with William just lingering, making sure that Springtrap stayed down. Ultimate Custom Night is the true showcase of this duality. Cassidy, the Vengeful Spirit, is the one pulling the strings. She creates the torment around William, keeping him in an eternal purgatory. But Cassidy's agony, Shadow Freddy, is the one that you should not have killed. Cassidy is the mastermind, her agony the aggressor. Charlotte is the shepherd, and her agony the protector. Honestly, I think that's the strongest argument we have for the identity of these two very confusing figures. You could even extrapolate that since agony creatures seem to be able to change their shape, Nightmarion and Nightmare could be extensions of Charlotte and Charlie as well, but that's kind of stretching thin. It really shows you that the books can come in handy when parts of the lore in the games just don't seem to make sense, especially when you consider what the timeline of the games looks like without any input from the books at all. You can see what that would look like in that video over there. And now that my voice is finally back to normal, and I just got a new microphone if you couldn't tell, I'm happy to announce that we can finally do the charity live stream where I'm reading every FNAF book for the Trevor Project tomorrow, January 21st, a Saturday, 11 a.m. to 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It'll be a 12-hour live stream where I'm going to read as much of the books as possible. It'll be tons of fun. We'll have milestones within the live stream, please, please, please come and check it out and support the Trevor Project at the same time. Of course, if you can't donate, do not worry about that at all. Look out for yourself first. But if you're able to share the live stream, that would mean the world. So I'll see you then. But for now, a big thank you to the best patrons, the Toasted Slices, Emberisk, Zenith, Raven Eris, Charlie Bean, Lovey Puppy, Stormachow, Just BKZ, Chickpea, Lola Fembo, The Viper 26, Lehan, 1Un4, Dionysus, James Reiner, Loose Harriet, and Emily De La Sierra. And until next time, as always, stay toasty, Slices.